Through 2017, church-related business expenses could be reimbursed tax-free or be claimed as unreimbursed expenses for ministers on Schedule A. However, the deduction on Schedule A disappeared beginning in 2018 thanks to tax reform. So let's review together the basics about business expenses and how they should be handled to maximize the stewardship impact for both the church and the minister. Church-related business and professional expenses fall into three basic categories: expenses reimbursed under an accountable plan, expenses paid under a non-accountable plan, and unreimbursed expenses. Neither of the last two categories provide any income tax benefit to a minister. The reimbursement of a personal expense by a church does not change the character of the item from personal to business. Business expenses are business expenses, whether or not they are reimbursed. Personal expenses are always non-deductible and non-reimbursable. Let's now cover 5 key issues relating to business expenses. Number 1, business expenses for ministers. Business expenses must be both ordinary and necessary. Ordinary expenses are ones that are common in churches. Necessary expenses are those that are helpful or essential to conduct the business of the church. A typically significant business expense for a ministry relates to a church-related mileage driven by a minister using a personally owned vehicle. Auto expenses may be reimbursed on the actual or mileage rate methods. Most ministers use the mileage method because of its simplicity. The standard mileage rate, adjusted annually by the IRS, is based on the government's estimate of the average cost of operating an auto. If you use the mileage rate method, you also may be reimbursed for parking fees, tolls, and the business portion of the personal property tax. If the church reimburses a minister using a mileage rate up to the IRS standard rate, and the minister provides the church with the time, place, and business purpose of the miles, an adequate accounting has been made, and we have met the qualifications for a tax-free reimbursement. Personal mileage is never reimbursable. Commuting mileage is personal mileage. Travel to and from home and church, which is a regular work location, and for church services and other work at the church, is commuting and is not reimbursable. The same rule applies to multiple trips that are made in the same day. On the other hand, the cost of traveling between a minister's home and a temporary work location is generally reimbursable. A hospital or office supply store often generally qualifies as a temporary work location. Once you arrive at the first work location, temporary or regular, you may be reimbursed for trips between work locations. Here's a quick example. A minister who doesn't qualify for an office at home drives from home to the church. The trip is commuting and is treated as personal mileage. The minister leaves the church and drives to a hospital to call on a member. From the hospital, the minister drives to the home of a prospect to make a call. These trips qualify for business mileage regardless of whether the hospital qualifies as a regular or a temporary work location. From the prospect's house, the minister drives home. This trip is also eligible for reimbursement since the minister is driving from a temporary work location. Number 2, understanding the concept of expense substantiation. For expenses to be treated as a tax-free reimbursement, a minister must show that the money was spent and spent for a legitimate business reason. To prove that the money was spent, a minister will generally need to provide documentary evidence that can be confirmed by a third party. For example, canceled checks, credit card statements, or other receipts. Documenting a business expense can be time-consuming. Just remember, the IRS is satisfied if the 5 W's are noted. Why, which is a business purpose. What, which would be the description, including an itemized accounting of the cost. When, which is the date. Where, the location. And then who, the names of those for whom the expense was incurred. Number 3, business expenses reimbursed under an accountable plan. An accountable plan is an arrangement established by your church that requires a business purpose for the expense, substantiation of the expenses to the church, and the return of any excess reimbursements to the church. Expenses that are substantiated and reimbursed under an accountable plan are not included on the minister's Form W-2. Number 4, non-accountable expense reimbursements or allowances. Expenses that are reimbursed but not substantiated do not qualify as a tax-free reimbursement. The same is true for excess reimbursements over the IRS mileage or per diem limits. If a church pays an allowance in lieu of reimbursing substantiated business expenses, the allowance is not tax-free just because it's called an allowance. Number 5, the impact of unreimbursed business expenses. Under the current tax law, unreimbursed business expenses have no income tax value, except for business expenses related to Schedule C income generated from things like weddings and funeral fees, speaking honoraria, and the like. Business expenses related to ministerial income cannot be deducted for federal income tax purposes. Unreimbursed business expenses can be deducted, however, in the self-employment Social Security tax calculation. In summary, church-related business expenses should be reimbursed under an accountable expense reimbursement plan in order to properly steward the financial resources of both the church and the minister.